The rain hammered against the church windows as I sat in the back row, watching my own father's funeral from a distance. My family had made it clear I wasn't welcome in the front pews with them. After all, what place did a college dropout have among doctors, lawyers, and successful business people? I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But as the service was ending, something happened that would change everything. A tall man in a perfectly tailored suit stood up from the middle section. The entire congregation fell silent as he walked to the front, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. When he turned to face us all, I felt my blood run cold. "Agent Thompson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent church. "Would you please stand?" Growing up as Sarah Thompson, in the affluent suburb of Westfield, Connecticut, I had always been different from my family. My father, Dr. Marcus Thompson, was a renowned cardiac surgeon who had built his reputation saving lives at Hartford Medical Center. My mother, Eleanor, was a federal judge who commanded respect in every courtroom she entered. My older brother, Michael, had followed in Dad's footsteps and was completing his residency in neurosurgery at Yale. My younger sister, Rebecca, was finishing her law degree at Harvard with honors. And then there was me. I had always been the odd one out. While my siblings excelled in academics and pursued prestigious careers, I struggled with traditional learning. I was dyslexic, though my family never seemed to understand the challenges that came with it. To them, my difficulties with reading and writing were simply a lack of effort or focus. They saw my struggles as character flaws rather than learning differences. "Sarah just needs to apply herself more," my mother would say during family dinners when report cards came up. "She has the same opportunities as Michael and Rebecca." But I didn't see the world the same way they did. While they focused on textbooks and lectures, I was drawn to understanding people, reading situations, and noticing details that others missed. I had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was lying, to pick up on subtle behavioral cues, and to remember faces and voices with perfect clarity. These skills meant nothing to my family, who valued only academic achievement and professional success. High school was a nightmare. Despite my best efforts, I barely maintained a C average. My parents hired tutors, enrolled me in expensive prep courses, and even considered holding me back a year. Nothing seemed to work. The harder I tried to fit into their mold, the more I felt like a failure. College wasn't much better. I enrolled at the University of Connecticut, planning to major in business administration simply because it seemed like the most practical choice. But sitting in lecture halls, struggling to keep up with reading assignments, and feeling lost in a sea of students who seemed to effortlessly absorb information, I began to question everything. The breaking point came during my sophomore year. I had been working part-time at a local coffee shop near campus to help pay for expenses, despite my parents' disapproval. "A Thompson doesn't work in food service," my mother had said coldly when I told her about the job. But I needed the money, and more importantly, I needed to prove to myself that I could succeed at something. It was at that coffee shop that I met Detective James Rodriguez from the New Haven Police Department. He was a regular customer who always ordered the same thing: black coffee, no sugar, and a blueberry muffin. What struck me about Detective Rodriguez wasn't just his routine, but the way he observed everything around him. He noticed when new employees started, remembered personal details about regular customers, and had an ability to read people that fascinated me. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, Detective Rodriguez approached me with an unusual request. There had been a series of break-ins in the area, and the police were struggling to find any leads. The perpetrator was skilled at avoiding security cameras and left no fingerprints. But I had noticed something that might help. "There's been a guy coming in here for the past few weeks," I told him. "Always orders a large coffee around 9 p.m., pays in cash, and never makes eye contact. But here's the thing. He's been asking casual questions about the neighborhood. When businesses close, who works late, stuff like that. And his hands." I paused, recalling the detail that had stuck with me. "His hands are always covered in small cuts, like he's been working with broken glass or metal." Detective Rodriguez listened intently as I described the man's appearance, his mannerisms, and the pattern of his visits. 2 days later, they arrested someone matching that exact description. The cuts on his hands were from breaking windows during the burglaries. "You have a gift," Detective Rodriguez told me when he came to thank me. "Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" The idea had never crossed my mind. In my family, law enforcement was seen as beneath our social status. But for the first time in my life, someone was telling me that the way my mind worked, the way I noticed details and read people, was valuable. I started spending more time talking with Detective Rodriguez about his work. He told me about cases he'd solved, investigative techniques, and the satisfaction of bringing justice to victims. The more I learned, the more interested I became. But I knew my family would never understand or support such a decision. The confrontation came during the Christmas break of my sophomore year. I had been researching criminal justice programs and law enforcement careers, and I made the mistake of leaving some printed materials on my desk. My mother found them while cleaning my room. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up a brochure for the FBI Academy. "Sarah, please tell me you're not seriously considering this." The family meeting that followed was brutal. My father sat at the head of our mahogany dining table, his face stern and disappointed. My mother paced back and forth, her judicial robes metaphorically flowing behind her, as she listed all the reasons why law enforcement was unsuitable for a Thompson. Michael, who was home from medical school, shook his head in disbelief. Rebecca, always the lawyer, presented a logical argument about why I should reconsider. "You're throwing away your future," my father said finally. "You have opportunities that most people can only dream of. Thompson doesn't become a police officer." "But Dad, I'm good at this," I tried to explain. "I helped solve those break-ins, and Detective Rodriguez thinks I have potential." "Potential for what?" my mother interjected. "To waste your life chasing criminals instead of building a respectable career? Sarah, you're being naive." The argument escalated from there. Harsh words were exchanged, and ultimatums were made. My parents made it clear that if I continued down this path, I would be on my own financially. They wouldn't support what they saw as a foolish decision that would bring shame to the family name. But I had found something that made me feel alive for the first time in my life. Despite the pressure from my family, I made the decision to change my major to criminal justice. I threw myself into my studies with a passion I had never felt before. Courses on criminal psychology, forensic science, and investigative techniques came naturally to me. For the first time, I wasn't struggling to keep up. I was excelling. My grades improved dramatically. I was making A's and B's consistently, participating in class discussions, and even helping other students with their coursework. My professors noticed my aptitude and began encouraging me to consider graduate school or federal law enforcement. But my family saw only defiance and disappointment. Family dinners became tense affairs, where my career choice was either ignored or criticized. When I would share my academic successes, they would respond with comments like, "That's nice, dear, but when are you going to get serious about your future?" The final straw came during my junior year when I was accepted into a prestigious internship program with the Connecticut State Police. It was a competitive position that would give me hands-on experience in criminal investigation and forensic analysis. I was thrilled and proud of my achievement. When I called home to share the news, my mother's response was devastating. "Sarah, I'm embarrassed to tell my colleagues that my daughter is playing police officer instead of pursuing a real career." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to apply to the FBI Academy after graduation, despite knowing it would create an irreparable rift with my family. I had found my calling, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even the people I loved most, stop me from pursuing it. The application process was rigorous. Physical fitness tests, psychological evaluations, background checks, and multiple interviews. Every step of the way, I proved that I had what it took to be a federal agent. My ability to read people, notice details, and think analytically, all the skills my family had dismissed as unimportant, were exactly what the FBI was looking for. When I received my acceptance letter to the FBI Academy at Quantico, I was alone in my small apartment near campus. There was no one to celebrate with, no family to share my pride and excitement. I had achieved something remarkable, but it felt hollow without the people I loved most understanding its significance. I decided to tell my family about my acceptance during what I hoped would be a celebratory dinner. I had prepared a speech about how this opportunity would allow me to serve my country and make a difference in the world. I imagined that maybe, just maybe, they would finally understand and support my decision. Instead, the dinner turned into the worst fight we had ever had. My father stood up from the table, his face red with anger and disappointment. "If you walk through those doors in Quantico," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "you are no longer welcome in this house. You are choosing to embarrass this family and waste your potential." My mother, always the judge, delivered her verdict. "Sarah, you are making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Don't expect us to be here when you finally come to your senses." Michael and Rebecca said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They had chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I left that dinner knowing that I was truly on my own. The next morning, I packed my belongings and drove to Quantico, Virginia, to begin my training as an FBI agent. I didn't look back, because I knew that if I did, I might lose the courage to follow my dreams. The training at Quantico was the most challenging experience of my life. 20 weeks of intensive coursework, physical training, and practical exercises designed to prepare us for the realities of federal law enforcement. I excelled in behavioral analysis, surveillance techniques, and criminal psychology. My instructors noted my exceptional ability to read people and situations, skills that would prove invaluable in the field. But despite my success, I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. While my fellow trainees called home to share their progress with supportive families, I had no one. My parents had made good on their threat to cut me off completely. They didn't return my calls, and when I tried to reach out through Michael and Rebecca, they made it clear that I was no longer considered part of the family. I graduated from the FBI Academy with honors, ranking in the top 10% of my class. It should have been one of the proudest moments of my life, but as I sat in the auditorium watching other new agents celebrate with their families, I felt more alone than ever. My first assignment was to the FBI field office in Boston, where I was placed in the Violent Crimes Unit. The work was challenging and dangerous, but I thrived in an environment where my unique skills were valued and utilized. I worked cases involving kidnapping, murder, and organized crime. My ability to read suspects during interrogations and notice details that others missed made me an asset to the team. Over the next several years, I built a reputation as a skilled and dedicated agent. I worked undercover operations, conducted complex investigations, and helped solve cases that had stumped other law enforcement agencies. My supervisors praised my work, and I received multiple commendations for my service. But professional success couldn't fill the void left by my family's rejection. I threw myself into my work, often volunteering for dangerous assignments and working long hours to avoid going home to an empty apartment. I had achieved everything I had dreamed of, but it felt meaningless without the people I loved most understanding and supporting my choices. Years passed, without any contact from my family. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael had become a successful surgeon like our father, and Rebecca had joined a prestigious law firm in New York. My parents continued their distinguished careers, and from the outside, it appeared as if they had simply erased me from their lives. I considered reaching out many times, especially during holidays and family milestones. But I knew that my career choice remained a source of shame for them, and I couldn't bear the thought of another rejection. So I maintained my distance, focusing on my work and trying to build a life without them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had dedicated my life to protecting others and seeking justice, but I couldn't find a way to heal the wounds in my own family. Every case I solved, every criminal I helped put behind bars, every life I helped save, none of it mattered to the people whose approval I desperately wanted. It was during this period of isolation that I began to understand the true cost of following my dreams. Success in my chosen field couldn't compensate for the loss of my family's love and support. I had proven them wrong about my potential, but I had lost everything that mattered most in the process. Little did I know that everything was about to change in a way I could never have imagined. 5 years into my FBI career, I was assigned to a case that would define my entire professional trajectory. The Boston field office had been struggling with a series of sophisticated financial crimes that seemed impossible to solve. Banks across New England were being targeted by an organized group that somehow managed to bypass every security measure, leaving no digital footprints and seemingly vanishing into thin air after each heist. The case had been passed between different units for months. The cybercrime division couldn't trace the digital aspects, the financial crimes unit was baffled by the money laundering techniques, and the organized crime task force couldn't identify the players involved. That's when Assistant Director Patricia Hartwell called me into her office. "Thompson, I'm putting you on the Phantom Network case," she said, sliding a thick file across her desk. "Fresh eyes, different approach. I want you to forget everything the other units have tried and start from scratch." The Phantom Network, as the media had dubbed them, had stolen over $40 million from 17 different banks across 6 states. What made them particularly dangerous was their ability to adapt their methods after each job, never repeating the same technique twice. Traditional investigative approaches had failed because the perpetrators seemed to anticipate every move law enforcement would make. I spent my first week on the case doing something none of the previous investigators had done. I visited every single crime scene personally, not to look for physical evidence that had long since been collected, but to understand the psychology behind the locations chosen. Why these specific banks? What made them attractive targets beyond their obvious vulnerabilities? The pattern I discovered wasn't in the security systems or the money, it was in the people. Each targeted bank had experienced recent personnel changes. New employees, transfers, or departures that had occurred within 3 months of the robbery. Someone with inside knowledge was either directly involved or being manipulated to provide information. I began conducting interviews with current and former employees, focusing not on their potential involvement but on their observations about workplace dynamics. During one of these interviews at First National Bank in Hartford, a recently retired security guard named Walter Fleming mentioned something that caught my attention. "There was this woman who used to come in regularly," he said. "Real friendly, always chatted with the tellers. Said she was writing a book about small-town banking or something. But she asked a lot of specific questions about procedures, schedules, that kind of thing. Seemed harmless enough at the time." This mysterious woman had visited multiple banks in the weeks leading up to the robberies, always with the same story about research for a book. Security footage showed her at different locations, but she was skilled at avoiding clear facial shots. What struck me was how she tailored her approach to each bank's culture, presenting herself as exactly the type of person who would blend in and gain trust. The breakthrough came when I realized that the woman's cover story about writing a book wasn't entirely fabricated. She had actually published articles about financial institutions in regional magazines, giving her credibility when she approached bank employees. Cross-referencing bylines with the timeline of the robberies, I identified a freelance journalist named Victoria Manning, who had written pieces about community banking throughout New England. But Victoria Manning, I discovered, didn't exist. The identity was a carefully constructed cover, complete with social media profiles, a professional website, and a portfolio of legitimate articles. Someone had spent months building this persona specifically for the purpose of gaining access to banks. The real identity behind Victoria Manning was Dr. Melissa Chen, a former psychology professor who had been dismissed from Boston University 3 years earlier for conducting unauthorized research involving deception and manipulation. Her academic background had given her the skills to read people and situations, much like my own abilities, but she had chosen to use them for criminal purposes. Dr. Chen had recruited a team of 5 individuals, each with specific skills necessary for the operation. There was Marcus Rivera, a former bank IT specialist who had been fired for attempting to hack into his employer's system. Jennifer Walsh, an ex-military logistics coordinator who planned the precise timing and execution of each job. David Kim, a money laundering expert who had previously worked for organized crime families. And finally, Robert Sterling, a master of disguise who had trained as a special effects artist before turning to fraud. What made this group particularly dangerous was their leader's psychological expertise. Dr. Chen had studied each team member's motivations, fears, and psychological triggers, allowing her to maintain complete control over the operation. She knew exactly what to say to keep them loyal and focused, while preventing any one member from becoming too powerful or independent. The investigation took months of careful surveillance and psychological profiling. I had to think like Dr. Chen, anticipating her moves and understanding her methodology. The key was recognizing that she wasn't just stealing money. She was conducting a complex psychological experiment, testing her theories about human behavior and institutional vulnerabilities. The arrest came during what was supposed to be their final job, a planned heist at Merchants Bank in Springfield. We had identified the target through careful analysis of their pattern and had set up a comprehensive surveillance operation. When Dr. Chen arrived at the bank in her Victoria Manning disguise, we were ready. But the arrest almost went wrong. Dr. Chen had suspected she was being watched and had prepared contingencies. She had spotted our surveillance team and was attempting to abort the mission when we moved in. The confrontation was intense, with Dr. Chen trying to use her psychological training to manipulate the situation, even as she was being arrested. "You understand what it's like to be underestimated," she said to me as I placed her in handcuffs. "You know what it feels like when people can't see your true potential. We're not so different, Agent Thompson." She was right that we shared certain abilities, but she had fundamentally misunderstood something crucial. My skills in reading people and situations had led me to a career dedicated to protecting others, while hers had led her to exploit and manipulate them. The difference wasn't in our abilities. It was in our character and the choices we made about how to use our gifts. The Phantom Network case made national headlines when the arrests were announced. The sophisticated nature of the operation, the psychological manipulation involved, and the innovative investigative techniques used to solve it captured public attention. Major news outlets covered the story extensively, and I found myself being interviewed by reporters and asked to speak at law enforcement conferences. Assistant Director Hartwell called me into her office the day after the arrests were finalized. "Thompson, you did exceptional work on this case. The methodology you developed has already been adopted by other field offices dealing with similar crimes. I'm recommending you for promotion to Supervisory Special Agent." The promotion came with increased responsibilities and recognition within the Bureau. I was assigned to lead a new unit focused on crimes involving psychological manipulation and deception. The work was challenging and fulfilling, allowing me to use my unique skills to train other agents and develop new investigative techniques. But professional success couldn't fill the emptiness I felt when I returned to my apartment each night. The media attention had been extensive enough that I was certain my family had seen the news coverage. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would reach out to congratulate me, or acknowledge that I had made the right choice about my career. The silence was deafening. Not a single phone call, email, or message. It was as if they had seen their daughter's face on national television, heard about her success in solving a major case, and still couldn't bring themselves to admit they had been wrong about her potential. I began to understand that no amount of professional achievement would ever be enough to win back their approval. They had made their decision about who I was and what I was worth, and no evidence to the contrary would change their minds. It was a devastating realization that left me questioning whether all my success had been worth the cost. The loneliness was compounded by the nature of my work. As a federal agent, I couldn't maintain normal relationships or share details about my professional life with friends. The demands of the job, combined with the emotional toll of my family's rejection, created an isolation that success couldn't cure. I threw myself deeper into my work, taking on increasingly complex cases and accepting assignments that other agents considered too dangerous or difficult. If I couldn't have the approval of my family, I would at least have the respect of my colleagues and the satisfaction of knowing I was making a difference. Little did I know that the biggest case of my career was yet to come, and it would involve someone much closer to home than I ever could have imagined. 2 years after the Phantom Network case, I received a call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March when Assistant Director Hartwell summoned me to her office with unusual urgency. When I arrived, I found her speaking quietly with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, distinguished, with graying temples and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. "Agent Thompson," Hartwell said, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Director William Hayes from FBI headquarters in Washington." Deputy Director Hayes studied me for a moment before speaking. "Agent Thompson, your work on complex psychological cases has caught the attention of some very important people. I'm here to discuss a classified assignment that requires your specific skill set. The assignment, as it turned out, was unlike anything I had ever worked on. For the past 18 months, the Bureau had been investigating a sophisticated espionage network operating within the United States. The suspects weren't foreign agents in the traditional sense, but rather American citizens who had been recruited and manipulated by a foreign intelligence service through elaborate psychological operations. What made this case particularly challenging was the profile of the individuals involved. They weren't motivated by money or ideology, but had been psychologically manipulated into believing they were participating in legitimate research or business ventures. The foreign operatives had identified people with access to sensitive information and had spent months or even years building relationships with them, slowly extracting classified data without the targets ever realizing they were being used. The psychological sophistication of this operation is unprecedented, Deputy Director Hayes explained. We need someone who can understand the manipulation techniques being used and help us identify both the handlers and their victims. The case was codenamed Operation Mirror, and I was assigned to a joint task force that included agents from the FBI, CIA, and NSA. The team was based in a secure facility in Quantico, and for the next 6 months, my entire life revolved around understanding the psychological profiles of both the operatives and their victims. The Foreign Intelligence Service had been incredibly patient and methodical. They had identified targets years in advance, studying their personal lives, professional relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. The recruitment process was so gradual that victims genuinely believed they were helping with legitimate academic research or business consulting. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was discovering how the operatives had targeted people in positions of trust within government agencies, defense contractors, and research institutions. These weren't individuals who had sought out opportunities for espionage. They were dedicated professionals who had been expertly manipulated into betraying their country without even realizing it. My role was to develop psychological profiles of the handlers and create strategies for identifying their victims. The work required me to think like the enemy, to understand their methodology and anticipate their next moves. It was intellectually challenging in ways that pushed me to my limits, but it was also deeply disturbing to see how easily good people could be manipulated when the right psychological techniques were applied. The breakthrough came when I realized that the foreign operatives were using a technique called emotional scaffolding. They were building relationships with targets based on genuine emotional needs and vulnerabilities, then gradually introducing requests that seemed reasonable and harmless. Over time, these small requests escalated into more serious breaches of security. Working with the CIA's Behavioral Analysis Unit, I helped develop a program to identify individuals who might be vulnerable to this type of manipulation. The program analyzed personality traits, personal circumstances, and professional situations to flag people who might be at risk. It was controversial work, as it involved psychological profiling of American citizens, but it was necessary to protect national security. The investigation led us to a cell of 5 foreign operatives who had been operating in the United States for over a decade. They had successfully recruited 17 American citizens, most of whom had no idea they were involved in espionage. The scope of the information they had obtained was staggering: defense contracts, research data, diplomatic communications, and intelligence reports. The arrests were coordinated across multiple states and had to be executed simultaneously to prevent any members of the network from escaping or destroying evidence. I was part of the team that arrested the cell leader, a woman named Elena Volkov, who had been operating under the identity of a cultural attaché at a foreign consulate. Volkov was perhaps the most sophisticated operative I had ever encountered. During her interrogation, she demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that was both impressive and terrifying. She had spent years studying American culture, language, and social norms, allowing her to blend seamlessly into academic and professional circles. "You have impressive analytical skills, Agent Thompson," she said during one of our sessions. "You understand people in ways that most of your colleagues cannot. Such abilities are rare and valuable." Her attempt to flatter and potentially recruit me was obvious, but I couldn't help but be disturbed by how easily she had manipulated so many intelligent, well-meaning people. The victims of her operation included a NASA engineer, a State Department analyst, a defense contractor, and several university professors. All of them had believed they were helping with legitimate research or cultural exchange programs. The success of Operation Mirror earned me a commendation from the director of the FBI and recognition from the intelligence community. The psychological profiling techniques I had developed were adopted by other agencies and used to prevent similar operations. I was invited to speak at classified conferences and to train other agents in recognizing and countering foreign influence operations, but the case also took a personal toll. Working in the shadowy world of counterintelligence, surrounded by deception and manipulation, made it difficult to trust anyone or maintain normal relationships. The classified nature of my work meant I couldn't share details with friends or colleagues outside the intelligence community, further isolating me from civilian life. The isolation was compounded by a disturbing realization about my own family. During the background investigations required for my security clearance upgrades, I learned that my father had been contacted by investigators years earlier when I first joined the FBI. The standard procedure included interviewing family members about an agent's character and potential vulnerabilities. According to the classified files I was now authorized to access, my father had told investigators that I was, quote, unreliable and prone to poor judgment. He had suggested that my dyslexia and academic struggles indicated potential security risks. My mother had been more diplomatic, but had expressed concerns about my emotional stability and decision-making abilities. Reading those reports was devastating. Not only had my family rejected me personally, but they had actively undermined my professional credibility with the very organization I had dedicated my life to serving. The investigators had ultimately concluded that my family's concerns were unfounded, but knowing they had tried to sabotage my career added another layer of pain to an already complicated relationship. The irony was bitter. While my family had questioned my reliability and judgment, I had spent years protecting national security and solving cases that had stumped other agents. The psychological skills they had dismissed as worthless had made me one of the FBI's most effective counterintelligence operatives. As I advanced in my career, taking on increasingly sensitive assignments and earning the respect of my colleagues, the contrast between my professional success and personal isolation became more pronounced. I had proven my worth to the intelligence community, but I remained estranged from the people whose approval I had once desperately sought. The classified nature of my work meant that even if my family had wanted to reconcile, I couldn't share the details of my achievements with them. They would never know about the terrorist plots I had helped prevent, the foreign spies I had identified, or the national security threats I had neutralized. My most important work would forever remain invisible to them. It was during this period of professional triumph and personal isolation that I received the phone call that would change everything. My sister Rebecca was calling to tell me that our father was dying. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in November. I was in my apartment in Washington, D.C., reviewing case files for an upcoming assignment, when my secure phone rang. The voice on the other end was Rebecca, and she was crying. "Sarah, it's Dad. He's dying. The doctors say he has maybe a week." I hadn't spoken to Rebecca in 8 years, not since that devastating family dinner when I had chosen my career over their approval. Hearing her voice brought back a flood of emotions I had spent years trying to suppress. "What happened?" I asked, my training kicking in despite the personal nature of the call. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He's been fighting it for months, but..." Her voice broke. "He's been asking for you, Sarah. He wants to see you before..." The conversation was awkward and painful. Rebecca explained that our father had been diagnosed 6 months earlier but had refused to let anyone contact me. He had been stubborn about it, insisting that I had made my choice and he had made his. But as his condition deteriorated, he had finally admitted that he wanted to see me one last time. "The funeral is planned for next Wednesday at St. Catherine's Church in Westfield," Rebecca said. "I know things have been difficult between you and the family, but maybe you could come? For Dad?" I wanted to say yes immediately, but there was a complication. I was scheduled to leave for an undercover assignment in Eastern Europe the following Monday. The mission was classified at the highest levels and had been in planning for months. My handler had specifically chosen me because of my psychological profiling abilities and my experience with foreign intelligence operations. "I'll try," I told Rebecca, knowing that getting approval to delay the mission would be nearly impossible. The next morning, I met with Deputy Director Hayes to request emergency leave. I explained the situation as best I could without revealing too much about my personal life. Hayes listened carefully, then shook his head. Thompson, I understand this is personal, but the timing couldn't be worse. The Prague operation has been in development for 6 months. We have assets in place, and the window for this mission is extremely narrow. If we delay, we may not get another chance. The Prague operation was designed to identify and neutralize a network of arms dealers who had been selling weapons to terrorist organizations. My role was to go undercover as an art dealer and establish contact with the network's financial coordinator. The psychological profile I had developed suggested that this individual had a weakness for American women with expertise in cultural artifacts. Sir, I haven't seen my family in 8 years, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This might be my last chance to reconcile with my father before he dies. Hayes considered this for a long moment. I'm sorry, Thompson, I know this is difficult, but national security has to come first. The Prague operation launches Monday as scheduled. I left his office feeling torn between duty and family. My entire adult life had been dedicated to serving my country, often at great personal cost. But now, when I had a chance to potentially heal the wounds with my family, duty was once again demanding sacrifice. That evening, I called Rebecca back to tell her I might not be able to make it to the funeral. The disappointment in her voice was crushing. I should have expected this, she said bitterly. You always put your job first. Even now, when Dad is dying, you can't be bothered to show up. It's not like that, Rebecca. I want to be there, but I have responsibilities. Responsibilities? She interrupted. What about your responsibility to your family? What about your responsibility to Dad? The conversation ended badly, with Rebecca hanging up on me. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the case files for the Prague operation, wondering if I had made the right choices in my life. I had dedicated everything to my career, sacrificing personal relationships and family connections for the sake of duty and professional success. The next few days were a blur of preparation for the Prague mission. I studied the psychological profiles of the targets, memorized my cover identity, and prepared for what would be one of the most dangerous assignments of my career. But throughout the preparation, I couldn't stop thinking about my father lying in a hospital bed, asking for a daughter who might not come. On Friday, 3 days before the funeral, I received an unexpected visitor. Deputy Director Hayes appeared at my apartment door with a grave expression. Thompson, we need to talk, he said. There's been a development in the Prague operation. I invited him in, expecting to hear about changes to the mission parameters or additional intelligence about the targets. Instead, he sat down at my kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Sarah, how much do you know about your father's work during the Cold War? The question caught me completely off guard. His work? He was a cardiac surgeon. He saved lives at Hartford Medical Center. Hayes pulled out a classified file and placed it on the table. Your father was more than a surgeon, Sarah. Dr. Marcus Thompson was also a CIA asset who provided critical intelligence during some of the most dangerous operations of the Cold War era. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the file, unable to process what I was hearing. My father, who had always criticized my choice to work in intelligence, had been an intelligence operative himself? During the 1980s, your father worked as a surgeon at a hospital in Berlin that treated both American and Soviet personnel. Hayes continued. He provided the CIA with intelligence about Soviet military capabilities, troop movements, and strategic plans. His medical position gave him access to high-ranking officials who required surgical treatment. I opened the file with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, documents, and reports spanning nearly a decade. My father had been involved in operations that had helped end the Cold War, providing intelligence that had saved countless lives and prevented potential conflicts. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious. Because your father's handler during those operations was someone you know, someone who has been watching your career with great interest. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing my father with a younger man in a military uniform. I recognized the face immediately. It was FBI Director Jonathan Pierce, though the photo had been taken 30 years earlier when he was a CIA operative. Director Pierce personally requested that you be assigned to the Prague operation, Hayes explained. He's been following your career since you joined the Bureau, not just because of your abilities, but because of your connection to your father. The pieces were starting to fall into place. My rapid advancement, the high-profile cases I had been assigned, the classified missions, they weren't just because of my skills. Director Pierce had been watching over me, perhaps as a way of honoring his relationship with my father. There's more, Hayes said. Your father's illness wasn't random. 3 months ago, he contacted Director Pierce and told him about his cancer diagnosis. He also told him that he wanted to see you before he died, but he was too proud to reach out directly. I felt tears forming in my eyes as I realized what this meant. My father, who had always seemed so cold and disapproving, had been secretly proud of my work. He had been in contact with the FBI director, asking about my career and my well-being. Director Pierce has made a decision, Hayes continued. The Prague operation has been postponed. You're going home for your father's funeral, and you're going with the director's blessing. As I sat there processing this information, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my father had been wrong. He hadn't been ashamed of my career choice. He had been proud of it. He had been watching my progress from afar, unable to openly support me because of his own classified past. The next morning, I packed my bags and drove to Connecticut, knowing that I was about to face the most difficult and important mission of my life, not as an FBI agent, but as a daughter trying to make peace with her dying father. I arrived at Hartford Hospital on a cold Saturday morning in late November. The familiar halls of the medical center where my father had built his reputation felt different now, knowing the secret life he had led. Every step toward his room carried the weight of 8 years of separation and a lifetime of misunderstanding. Rebecca was waiting in the hallway outside room 314, looking exhausted and older than her 32 years. When she saw me approaching, her expression was a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "He's been asking for you every day," she said quietly. "But Sarah, you need to prepare yourself. He's not the same man you remember." The cancer had ravaged my father's once powerful frame. The distinguished surgeon who had commanded respect in operating rooms around the world now lay frail and diminished in a hospital bed. But his eyes, when they focused on me, still held the intelligence and intensity I remembered from childhood. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You came." I sat down in the chair beside his bed, unsure of what to say. How do you begin to heal 8 years of wounds in the few days that remain? How do you forgive someone who is dying, especially when you're not sure what you're forgiving them for? "Dad, I'm sorry I waited so long to—" He raised a trembling hand to stop me. "No apologies. I'm the one who owes you those." He struggled to sit up slightly, his breathing labored. "I know about your work, Sarah. I know what you've accomplished." The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to ask how much he knew, whether he understood the classified nature of my assignments, but I couldn't bring myself to break the moment. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "Wrong about your potential, wrong about your choices, wrong about everything. You became exactly what this country needed, and I was too proud and too stupid to see it." Over the next 2 days, my father slowly revealed the truth about his own past and his understanding of my career. He spoke carefully, aware that even in his final moments, some secrets had to be protected. But he made it clear that he knew more about my work than I had ever imagined possible. "When you joined the Bureau, I was terrified," he admitted during one of our conversations. "Not because I thought you would fail, but because I knew the costs of that life. I knew what it meant to serve in ways that your family could never understand or acknowledge." He told me about the sleepless nights during the Cold War, wondering if his double life would endanger his family. He described the isolation of carrying secrets that could never be shared, the weight of making decisions that affected national security while pretending to be nothing more than a dedicated surgeon. "I thought if I discouraged you, if I made it clear that path wasn't acceptable, you would choose something safer," he said. "I didn't want you to experience the loneliness I had lived with for so many years." But what struck me most was learning about the conversations he had been having with Director Pierce. My father had been receiving updates about my career, my assignments, and my achievements. He had known about the Phantom Network case, about my work in counterintelligence, about every major success in my professional life. "Jonathan told me about the Prague operation," he said with a weak smile. "He said you were willing to sacrifice an important mission to be here with me. That meant more to me than you'll ever know." My mother and siblings visited regularly during those 2 days, and slowly, the family dynamics began to shift. Michael and Rebecca started asking me questions about my work, within the limits of what I could share. They seemed genuinely interested in understanding the career they had dismissed for so many years. My mother was harder to reach. Judge Eleanor Thompson had built her life on principles of law and order, and she struggled to reconcile her image of proper professional conduct with the secretive world of intelligence work. But even she began to soften as she watched my father's obvious pride in my accomplishments. "Your father always worried about you," she told me during a quiet moment while he was sleeping. "Not because he thought you weren't capable, but because he knew you were capable of extraordinary things. He was afraid of what that might cost you." On Monday morning, my father's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. The doctors called the family together and explained that he had hours, not days, remaining. We gathered around his bed, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I was truly part of the Thompson family again. In his final conscious moments, my father took my hand with what little strength he had left. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he whispered. "Prouder than I ever knew how to say. You became the person I always hoped you could be, even when I was too afraid to tell you." He died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by his family. Despite all the years of conflict and misunderstanding, his final gift to me was the knowledge that he had always loved me and that he understood the value of the path I had chosen. The funeral was scheduled for Wednesday at St. Catherine's Church, the same church where I had been baptized and confirmed. As we planned the service, I learned that my father had left specific instructions about his burial. He wanted to be recognized not just as Dr. Marcus Thompson, the renowned surgeon, but as someone who had served his country in ways that couldn't be fully disclosed. "He wanted you to speak at the service," Rebecca told me. "He said you were the only one who would truly understand what his life meant." Writing a eulogy for my father was one of the most challenging things I had ever done. How do you honor a man's secret service to his country without revealing classified information? How do you explain the complexity of a relationship that had been shaped by secrets and misunderstanding? The night before the funeral, I sat in my childhood bedroom, working on the speech. The room had been preserved exactly as I had left it when I went to college, down to the posters on the walls and the books on the shelves. Looking around at the remnants of my adolescent dreams, I realized how far I had traveled from the uncertain girl who had once felt like a failure in her family's eyes. My secure phone rang around midnight. It was Deputy Director Hayes with an update about the Prague operation. "Thompson, I wanted you to know that we've rescheduled the mission for next month. The targets will still be in play, and your role remains crucial to the operation's success." "Thank you, sir. I'll be ready." "There's something else," Hayes continued. "Director Pierce asked me to tell you that your father's service record will be updated to reflect his contributions to national security. It won't be public, but it will be part of the official record." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my father's legacy would live on in ways that extended far beyond his medical career. His service during the Cold War, like my own work in the modern era, represented the quiet sacrifice of individuals who protected their country from the shadows. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and rainy, matching the somber mood of the assembled mourners. As I prepared to deliver my father's eulogy, I had no idea that the service would take a turn that would change how everyone in that church understood both my father's life and my own. St. Catherine's Church was filled to capacity on that gray Wednesday morning. The congregation included colleagues from Hartford Medical Center, fellow judges and attorneys who had worked with my mother, medical students who had trained under my father, and family friends spanning decades. I sat in the front pew with my family, still feeling like an outsider despite the reconciliation of the past few days. The service began with traditional hymns and readings. Several of my father's colleagues spoke about his contributions to cardiac surgery and his dedication to saving lives. The portrait they painted was of a brilliant physician who had touched countless lives through his medical expertise and compassionate care. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium with a carefully crafted eulogy that honored my father's memory, while respecting the classified nature of his other service. I spoke about his dedication to helping others, his commitment to excellence, and his love for his family. I mentioned his quiet service to causes larger than himself, without revealing specifics that could compromise national security. My father taught me that true service often requires sacrifice, I said, looking out at the assembled mourners. He showed me that sometimes the most important work we do is the work that others never see or acknowledge. He lived a life of purpose, protecting and healing others in ways both visible and invisible. As I spoke, I noticed several people in the congregation who seemed out of place among the medical professionals and family friends. They were well-dressed but alert in a way that suggested law enforcement or intelligence backgrounds. I wondered if Director Pierce had sent representatives to pay respects to my father's classified service. After I finished speaking, Father Morrison invited anyone who wished to share memories to come forward. Several people spoke briefly about my father's kindness and professional excellence. The service seemed to be winding down when something unexpected happened. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stood up from the middle section of the church. The entire congregation fell silent as he walked to the front, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Even before he turned to face us, I felt my pulse quicken with recognition. FBI Director Jonathan Pierce commanded the attention of everyone in that church, simply by his presence. At 62, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades in intelligence and law enforcement. When he turned to face the congregation, his piercing blue eyes swept across the assembled mourners before settling on me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "I apologize for interrupting this service, but I have something important to say about Dr. Marcus Thompson and his family." The congregation stirred with curiosity and confusion. My mother looked stunned, while Michael and Rebecca exchanged bewildered glances. I sat frozen, uncertain of what Director Pierce intended to reveal. "Many of you knew Dr. Thompson as a brilliant surgeon who saved countless lives at Hartford Medical Center," Director Pierce continued. "What you may not know is that Dr. Thompson also served his country in another capacity during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War." A murmur rippled through the church. Director Pierce raised his hand for silence and continued. "Dr. Marcus Thompson was a patriot who risked his life to provide critical intelligence that helped protect American interests and ultimately contributed to ending the Cold War. His service was classified at the highest levels, and for 30 years he carried those secrets with the dignity and honor that characterized everything he did." I watched my mother's face transform as she processed this revelation. The man she had been married to for 35 years had lived a secret life she had never suspected. The colleagues from the hospital looked equally shocked to learn that their respected surgeon had been involved in intelligence operations. "But I'm not here today just to honor Dr. Thompson's classified service," Director Pierce said, his gaze now fixed directly on me. "I'm here to speak about his daughter." My heart stopped. The entire congregation turned to look at me, and I felt exposed in a way I had never experienced before. Director Pierce's next words would either validate everything I had worked for, or destroy the careful boundaries I had maintained between my professional and personal life. "Agent Thompson," he said, his voice filled with unmistakable respect and authority, "would you please stand?" The silence in the church was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat as I slowly rose from my seat, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. Every eye in the church was focused on me, including my family members who were staring with expressions of complete shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Pierce announced, "I want you to know that you are in the presence of one of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's most distinguished agents. Agent Sarah Thompson has spent the last 10 years serving her country with the same courage and dedication that her father demonstrated during the Cold War." The words hit the congregation like a physical force. I heard my mother gasp, saw Michael's mouth fall open, and watched Rebecca's eyes widen with disbelief. The family, friends, and colleagues who had dismissed me as a college dropout were now learning that I was a federal agent. "Agent Thompson has solved cases that have saved American lives," Director Pierce continued. She has worked undercover operations that have dismantled criminal organizations and prevented terrorist attacks. Her work in counterintelligence has protected national security in ways that must remain classified, but I can tell you that her country owes her a tremendous debt of gratitude. I stood there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. For 8 years, I had lived with the pain of my family's rejection and the isolation that came with classified work. Now, in front of everyone who had ever doubted me, the director of the FB, I was publicly acknowledging my service and achievements. Dr. Thompson contacted me 3 months ago, Director Pierce revealed. He told me about his illness, and he told me how proud he was of his daughter's service to this nation. He asked me to ensure that Agent Thompson received the recognition she deserved, not just within the Bureau, but from the family and community that had never understood the true nature of her work. Tears were streaming down my face as I realized this was my father's final gift to me. He had arranged for this moment, knowing that I needed not just his private approval but public vindication of the choices I had made. Agent Thompson, Director Pierce said, addressing me directly, "Your father wanted everyone here to know that you became exactly the person he always hoped you would be. You chose a path of service and sacrifice, and you have honored both your country and your family name." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final statement. "Dr. Marcus Thompson was proud to be your father, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation is proud to call you Agent Thompson." As Director Pierce returned to his seat, the church erupted in spontaneous applause. My mother was crying, Michael and Rebecca looked stunned but proud, and the entire congregation was on their feet. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the approval and recognition I had always craved. After the service, as people filed out of the church, my family surrounded me with questions and apologies. My mother hugged me tighter than she had since I was a child, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never understood." Michael and Rebecca both admitted they had been wrong about my career choice, and they wanted to hear about my work, within the limits of what I could share. The family, friends, and colleagues who had once looked at me with pity or disappointment now approached with respect and admiration. But the most meaningful moment came when Director Pierce approached me privately. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled yourself today," he said. "He asked me to give you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter that began, "Sarah, if you're reading this, then Jonathan has kept his promise to help heal the wounds I created. You were always destined for greatness, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say so." As I stood in the cemetery watching my father's casket being lowered into the ground, I realized that his death had not just ended his life. It had given me back my family and my place in the community I had grown up in. The secrets that had divided us for so long had finally brought us together. 6 months later, I returned to my work with renewed purpose and the knowledge that my father's legacy lived on through my continued service. The Prague operation was a success, and I was promoted to assistant director, following in the footsteps of the man who had shaped both my father's life and my own. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen not in classified briefing rooms or dangerous undercover operations, but in small churches on rainy Wednesday mornings, when the truth finally sets you free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.